The bathroom was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of the day and lose myself in the soothing rhythm of the shower. The hot water cascaded down my body, easing the tension in my muscles and clouding the room with steam. The mirror was fogged and the air was thick with the scent of my lavender body wash. I leaned my head back, letting the water wash over my face, my thoughts drifting to the mundane tasks that awaited me once I stepped out. I didn't hear the soft creak of the door opening, the sound muffled by the steady stream of water, nor did I notice the subtle shift in the air as Daniel, my stepson, stepped inside. He was supposed to be out with friends, or so I'd thought, but there he was standing just inside the doorway, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of my silhouette behind the frosted glass of the shower door. I was oblivious at first, humming softly to myself as I lathered my arms with soap, but as I turned to rinse off, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat as I realized he was there, his hand moving under the waistband of his pants, his arousal unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. For a moment we just stared at each other, the air heavy with tension. The steam swirled around us, making the moment feel surreal, almost dreamlike. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something raw and unspoken. His breathing was shallow, his cheeks flushed, and I could tell he was as shocked as I was that he'd been caught. My first instinct was to scold him, to demand he leave immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, his gaze filled with a mix of shame and desire, or maybe it was the strange, unexpected flicker of something I didn't want to acknowledge deep within myself. Whatever it was, I stayed silent, allowing the moment to hang in the air, the tension between us growing with each passing second. Finally, he was the one to break the silence. Sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. He turned on his heel and fled the bathroom, the door closing softly behind him. The click of the latch seemed to echo in the stillness, leaving me standing alone under the water, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long time I just stood there, the water beating down on me as I tried to process what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of teenage curiosity that he'd quickly forget. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something about the way he'd looked at me, something that lingered in my mind long after I'd turned off the water and stepped out of the shower. I wrapped myself in a towel, my movements slow and deliberate as I tried to steady my thoughts. The mirror was still fogged, and I wiped it clear with my hand, staring at my reflection. My cheeks were flushed, my eyes wide and uncertain. I took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me like the steam still lingering in the air. As I left the bathroom and headed back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us had changed in a way I couldn't undo. I told myself it was just a moment, a blip in the rhythm of our lives that would soon be forgotten. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, still wrapped in the towel, the image of him standing there, his hand moving under his pants, played on an endless loop in my mind. It wasn't just the shock of the moment that stayed with me. It was the look in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me like I was something to be desired. I ran my hands over my body, the toe slipping slightly as I did. My skin was still damp, and the cool air made me shiver. I thought about the way Daniel's breath had hitched, the way his hand had moved under his waistband. I shouldn't have felt flattered, shouldn't have felt anything at all, but I did. It was wrong. I knew that, but the truth was, it felt good to be seen, to be desired. It had been months since I'd felt truly wanted. My husband Mark and I had fallen into a predictable routine, and intimacy had become something we scheduled rather than something we shared spontaneously. I missed the warmth of a touch, the thrill of being wanted, and as much as I hated to admit it, the look in Daniel's eyes had stirred something in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. This wasn't right. Daniel was my stepson. I had to remember that. But as I finally dressed and climbed into bed, the sheets cool against my skin, the image of him standing there, his eyes dark with something I didn't want to name, stayed with me. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, it was restless, filled with dreams that left me waking in the middle of the night, my heart racing and my skin hot. In the days following the bathroom incident, I couldn't shake the memory of Daniel's wide eyes, his hand moving under his waistband, the way he'd frozen when he realized caught him. It lingered in my mind, a flicker of heat I couldn't extinguish. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of teenage impulsiveness. But the truth was, it had stirred something in me too, something I wasn't ready to confront. Yet I couldn't help but notice how he avoided eye contact with me, how his cheeks flushed whenever I entered the room. It was as if the air between us had shifted, charged with an unspoken tension I hadn't anticipated. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to act normal, to pretend nothing had happened. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to pull me in. It was like a game, one I wasn't sure I wanted to play, but couldn't resist. And so subtly at first, I began to test the boundaries. It started one morning in the kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the countertops as I made coffee. Daniel was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, his posture casual, but his shoulders slightly tense. I could feel his awareness of me, the way his eyes flicked up whenever I moved. When I needed a cup from the cabinet above him, I leaned over him deliberately, letting my body brush against his shoulder. My shirt was loose, dipping slightly as I reached, and I noticed the way his breath hitched. "Oops," I said, softly, my voice light and teasing. I glanced down at him, catching the way his eyes darted away. As soon as they met mine, his cheeks turned pink, and I couldn't help but smile. "Need anything else, sweetheart?" I asked, my tone innocent, but laced with something else, something that made his face flush even deeper. He mumbled something incoherent, his phone slipping from his hands as he fumbled for words. I turned away, hiding my smile as I poured my coffee. It was a small thing, just a brush of contact, but I could feel the tension between us crackle. The thrill of it was undeniable, the way I could make him react with just the smallest hint of attention. As the days went on, the teasing became more deliberate. I found myself seeking out moments to be near him, using casual touches and playful remarks to see how far I could push. One afternoon, we were standing side by side at the sink, washing dishes. I leaned in closer than necessary, my arm brushing against his. He tensed, his hands stilling under the water, and I couldn't resist murmuring, "You're being awfully quiet today. Something on your mind?" He didn't answer, but I could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers gripped the plate he was holding just a little too hard. I stepped back, letting him feel the absence of my presence, and noticed the way his shoulders seemed to sag, not in relief, but something else. It fascinated me how easily I could affect him, and I couldn't resist doing it again. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I caught him staring at me from across the room. I was bending over to pick something up off the floor, and I could see the way his eyes lingered for just a second. Too long. Our eyes met, and instead of looking away like I usually would, I held his gaze, a small smile playing on my lips. "You know," I said, my voice low and teasing, "if you're going to stare, you might as well come closer." His eyes widened and he quickly turned away, muttering something about needing to take out the trash. I laughed softly, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something intoxicating about the way he reacted to me, the way his breath hitched and his face flushed at the smallest hint of attention. The teasing became a game, one I couldn't resist playing. One morning, as we stood together in the kitchen again, I decided to push a little further. I was making breakfast and he was standing nearby, pretending to be engrossed in his phone. I was wearing a cozy sweater, and I knew the way it hugged my figure was hard to ignore. The cool air made my nipples slightly hard, and I could see the way his eyes flicked toward me. Before he quickly looked away, I reached for the butter in the fridge, letting my hand brush against his. As I did, he froze, his eyes snapping to mine, and I leaned in slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, maybe you should come." In his face turned bright red, and he stammered something I couldn't quite catch. I giggled softly, the sound light and teasing, and turned back to the stove. I could feel his eyes on me though, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. It was a dangerous game I was playing, but I couldn't help myself. The power I felt in those moments was addictive. The way he hung on, my every word and touch, yet as much as I enjoyed the control, there was something else brewing beneath the surface. The way I felt when I was near him, the way my heart raced when he looked at me with those dark, intense eyes. It was something I hadn't felt in a long time. It scared me, but it also excited me, and I wasn't ready to let it go. One evening, after a long day, I decided to take a shower to unwind. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that made me feel like the only person awake. I wrapped myself in a towel, the soft fabric barely clinging to my damp skin, and headed toward the bathroom. But as I passed Daniel's room, I remembered I'd left something in there earlier. Maybe my hairbrush or lotion. I wasn't sure what it was exactly, but I thought it wouldn't hurt to check. I pushed the door open and stepped inside without knocking. Daniel was sitting on his bed, his phone in hand, but he quickly looked up when he saw me. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of me standing there in nothing but a towel, my hair still damp from the shower I hadn't yet taken. I didn't miss the way his gaze flickered over me, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Sorry," I said, my voice soft and apologetic, but laced with a hint of playfulness. "I think I left something in here earlier." He nodded, his eyes dropping to his phone, as if he couldn't trust himself to look at me for too long. I pretended not to notice, though I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the way he reacted. I moved toward the dresser, my bare feet padding softly against the floor. As I bent over to search for what I was looking for, the towel slipped slightly and I felt it begin to fall. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as the fabric pulled at my feet, leaving me completely exposed. For a moment, the room was utterly still. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, his shock palpable in the air. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, but there was something else too, a strange, unexpected thrill that made my stomach flutter. I turned to face him, my hands instinctively moving to cover myself, but I didn't rush to pick up the towel. His eyes were wide, his face flushed, and could see the struggle in his expression, the conflict between guilt and desire. He scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy, as he grabbed the towel and moved toward me. "Here," he muttered, his voice hoarse. As he wrapped the towel around me, his hands trembled slightly as they brushed against my skin. His touch lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and I couldn't help but notice the way his breath hitched when our eyes met. I reached up to hold the towel in place, my fingers brushing against his as I did. The air between us was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. I could see the way he was struggling to look at me, the way his gaze kept flickering to mine before darting away. But I didn't let him look away. I held his gaze, my voice soft and low as I whispered, "Why don't you join me in the shower?" His eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might protest, might say something about how wrong this was, how we shouldn't, but instead he nodded. I thought he might protest, might say something about how wrong this was, how we shouldn't, but instead he nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he swallowed hard. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire wearing with his guilt, but I didn't give him a chance to change his mind. I reached for his hand, my fingers intertwining with his, as led him toward the bathroom. The hallway felt him impossibly long, every step stretching out as if time itself had slowed. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisting with a mix of nerves and anticipation. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the way his hand tightened around mine as we walked. The tension between us was palpable, a thick electric current that crackled in the air. When we reached the bathroom, I stepped inside, the steam from the shower already beginning to fill the room. I turned to face him, my back pressed against the cool tile. As I looked up into his eyes, he hesitated for just a moment, his hand still gripping mine, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. But then, as if the dam had finally broken, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He stood a few steps away, still fully dressed, his shirt and pants clinging to him awkwardly in the humid air. His eyes were locked on me, his chest rising and falling, rapidly, the tension in his posture was unmistakable, and I could feel the weight of his gaze as it traveled over me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The awkwardness was palpable, the kind that made me second guess every decision that had led us here. But then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I stepped closer to him, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached for the hem of his shirt. He didn't stop me, his breath hitching as I pulled it up and over his head, letting it fall to the floor. His chest was smooth and damp from the steam, and I traced a hand down his torso, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. The water cascaded over us as we stepped under the shower head, soothing and electrifying all at once. My skin tingled as it made contact, the droplets sliding down my body and rivulets. I kept my eyes on his, searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, or permission. His expression was unreadable, a mix of desire, fire, and uncertainty that mirrored my own. Slowly, I reached out to touch his chest, my palm flattening against his damp skin. His heartbeat was rapid, thundering beneath my hand, and I felt a shiver run through him at the contact. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the water washing away the last remnants of hesitation. Gradually, the space between us disappeared, our bodies moving closer until there was nothing but heat and steam separating us. My hands slid up to his shoulders, my fingers tracing the curve of his muscles, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me flush against him. The first kiss was tentative, almost shy, as if neither of us was sure how far to go. But as our lips met, something shifted. The awkwardness melted away, replaced by a hunger that neither of us could deny. His mouth moved against mine with increasing urgency, his hands sliding down to grip my waist as he deepened the kiss. The sensation was intoxicating, the heat of his body against mine, sending sparks shooting through my veins. I kissed him back with equal fervor, my fingers tangling in his wet hair. As I pressed myself closer to him, the steam swirled around us, heightening the sensuality of the moment. And for a brief second, I allowed myself to forget everything else, who we were, what this meant, the consequences of our actions. In that moment, it was just us, lost in the heat of the water and the intensity of the connection between us. But then, as our kiss deepened, I felt something hard pressing against my stomach. My breath caught in my throat, and instinctively I pulled back my eyes, widening as I glanced down. My stomach dropped when I saw him. His size was more than I'd expected, and the realization hit me like a bucket of cold water. My heart raced, not with desire this time, but with panic. "We can't," I muttered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My voice was shaky, barely audible over the sound of the shower, but the weight of what I'd said hung heavy in the air. I stepped back, putting distance between us, and saw the confusion and frustration flash across his face before he could say anything. I turned and stepped out of the shower, grabbing a towel from the rack and wrapping it around myself. In one swift motion, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. I didn't look back as I fled the bathroom, leaving him standing there under the water, dazed and alone. The hallway was cold compared to the warmth of the bathroom, and I shivered as I hurried toward my room. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, my heart still pounding in my chest. I knew I'd crossed a line, pushed things further than they should have gone, and as I closed the door behind me, I could shake the feeling that I just made a mistake that would change everything. The days after I left Daniel standing, dazed and frustrated in the shower, were filled with a strange mix of guilt and longing. I told myself it was for the best, that we couldn't keep crossing boundaries like this, that it was wrong, dangerous, reckless. But the memory of his touch, the heat between us, lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I avoided him at first, keeping myself busy with work and chores, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that still crackled between us. Whenever we crossed paths, eventually it was Daniel who broke the silence. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, he walked in, his hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, but I nodded and followed him to the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling impossibly large for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. Then finally he broke the silence. I don't want to pretend like nothing happened, he said, his eyes fixed on mine. I know it's complicated, but I can't just pretend I don't feel this way. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him we couldn't, that it was wrong, but the words died on my lips. The truth was, I couldn't pretend either. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. As I struggled to find the right words, I don't know what we're doing, I admitted, finally, but I can't stop thinking about it either. And so somehow we found ourselves in the shower together again, not out of impulsiveness this time, but out of a shared unspoken need to explore whatever this was between us. The warm water cascaded over our bodies, washing away the initial awkwardness and leaving behind a growing comfort that allowed us to be vulnerable with each other. At first we stood silently, unsure how to proceed, but slowly the tension began to ease, replaced by a sense of connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. My eyes drifted downward and I couldn't help but smirk. No wonder you were so shy, I said, my voice light, but laced with amusement. You've been hiding something impressive. His face turned bright red, and he let out a nervous chuckle, his hands instinctively moving to cover himself. Shut up, he muttered, though there was a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I laughed, the sound echoing softly in the steamy room. Relax, I said, stepping closer to him. You don't have to be embarrassed. It's just us here. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he looked at me, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. I reached for his hands, gently pulling them away from his body and guiding them to my waist. Here, I said, softly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the water. Let me show you. I moved his hands slowly over my skin, teaching him how to touch me in a way that made my breath catch. His fingers were tentative at first, but as he grew more confident, his movements became bolder, more deliberate. I guided his hands over my shoulders, down my back, and along my hips, my own hands resting lightly on his. As I showed him what it felt good, the intimacy of it was overwhelming. The way his touch sent shivers running through me, but it was also strangely comforting. As the days passed, our showers became more than just physical encounters. They became a space where we could talk openly, where the steam and the water seemed to wash away our inhibitions. One evening as we stood together under the spray, I leaned against his chest, my back pressed against his warmth, his arms wrapped around me, his chin resting on my shoulder as the water cascaded over us. Do you ever think about what we're doing? I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. He tensed for a moment, his grip tightening slightly around me. All the time, he admitted, his voice low and heavy with emotion. It's all I can think about. I turned in his arms, looking up at him with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. Do you ever feel like we're making a mistake? He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find the right words. I don't know, he said. Inali, it doesn't feel like a mistake when I'm with you, but I know it's complicated. I nodded, my heart aching. With the truth of his words, it was complicated more than I wanted to admit. But in that moment, with his arms around me and the water washing away my doubts, it was hard to care about anything else. We talked about other things too, our dreams, our fears, the things we'd never told anyone else. The shower became a space where we could be honest with each other, where the walls we'd built around ourselves seemed to crumble under the weight of the steam and the warmth. I learned things about him that I'd never known before: his insecurities, his hopes for the future, the way he saw the world. And in turn, I shared parts of myself that I'd kept hidden for so long. One evening, as we rinsed the soap from our bodies, I turned to him with a play smile. You're getting pretty good at this, I teased, my fingers trailing lightly over his arms. I might have to keep you around. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and I felt a pang of affection for him that I hadn't expected. I think I'd like that, he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. As the days turned into weeks, our intimacy grew, each encounter deepening the connection between us. There were moments of laughter, like when I accidentally dropped the soap and he insisted on picking it up for me, his face turning red as I teased him about it. And there were moments of quiet intensity, like when he'd hold me close, were doing hung over us, a silent reminder of the risks we were taking. We didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. And as much as I tried to push it away, I knew that sooner or later we'd have to face the consequences of our actions. The evening sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, orange glow through the bathroom window. I stood in front of the mirror, still wrapped in a towel, the steam from the shower clinging to the air and fogging the glass. The warm water had done its job, leaving my skin flushed and my muscles relaxed. But my mind was anything but calm. The events of the past few weeks, our secret encounters, the growing intimacy, the unspoken tension had left me feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. I ran a brush through my damp hair, the rhythmic motion soothing in its familiarity. My reflection in the mirror was hazy, the steam blurring the edges, but I could see the faint flush on my cheeks, the way my eyes sparkled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Every time we stepped into the shower together, it felt like we were crossing line we could never uncross, and yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Neither could he. The towel clung to my body, the soft fabric still damp from the shower. I tilted my head to the side, brushing out the tangles in my hair, my movements slow and absent-minded. My thoughts kept drifting back to Daniel, the way his hands had felt on my skin under the warm spray, the intensity in his eyes, the way his breath had hitched when I teased him. It was impossible to ignore the pull between us, the way it seemed to grow stronger with every encounter. I didn't hear him enter the bathroom, but I felt him before I saw him. A sudden warmth pressed against my back, his hands resting lightly on my hips. His breath was soft and warm against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the evidence of his arousal pressing against me through the towel. My heart skipped a beat and I froze for a moment, the brush stilling in my hand. I glanced at him in the mirror, our eyes meeting in the fogged glass. His gaze was dark and intense, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as I turned to face him. I let the brush fall onto the counter, my hands instinctively reaching for him. His eyes searched mine as if asking for permission, and I could see the conflict in them, the desire wearing with his guilt. Without thinking, I reached up to cup his face with one hand, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He leaned into my touch, his hands tightening on my hips as he pulled me closer, and then without a word, I kissed him. It was deep and consuming, the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt or hesitation. His lips moved against mine with a desperate urgency, his hands sliding up my back to pull me even closer. I tangled my fingers in his damp hair, my body pressing against his as the tension between us built to an almost unbearable level. Our hands explored each other's bodies with a mixture of curiosity and need, the barriers of the towels quickly forgotten. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he was still afraid to cross that final line, but I guided him, showing him with my actions that it was okay, that I wanted this just as much as he did. My hands traveled over his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm, and I could feel the way his breath hitched whenever my fingers brushed against his skin. The air in the bathroom was thick with steam and desire, the sound of our breathing mingling with the soft hum of the fan. It was slow and intimate, every touch deliberate and filled with meaning. I could feel the tension building between us, the need to be closer, to cross that final line, and becoming almost unbearable. And then finally we gave in to it. Our movements became more urgent, the barriers between us disappearing completely as we surrendered to the heat and the intensity of the moment. It was a blur of sensations, his hands on my skin, the weight of his body against mine, the way he whispered my name like it was the only word he knew. When it was over, we stood there, our bodies pressed together and our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The steam still clung to the air, wrapping around us like a blanket, and I could feel his heartbeat echoing against my chest. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, holding each other, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a heavy blanket. I looked up at him, my eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance or understanding. His expression was unreadable, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place, but I could see the way his hands trembled as they rested on my hips. I reached up to brush a strand of damp hair from his face, my fingers lingering against his cheek as I tried to find the words to say. But in the end, I didn't need to say anything. He leaned down and kissed me again, this time slow and tender. And I knew that for better or worse, this was where we were now. There was no going back, no pretending that this hadn't happened. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for us, what it would mean for everything. The evening air was warm, the soft hum of the kitchen fan blending with the clatter of dishes as we prepared dinner. The earlier intensity of the bathroom had faded into a comfortable playfulness, the kind that made it easy to forget the weight of what we'd done. Daniel stood at the counter chopping vegetables with more focus than the task required, while I leaned against the fridge sipping a glass of wine and watching him with a sly smile. "You know," I said, my tone light but teasing, "you're surprisingly good at that. Is there anything you can't do?" He glanced up at me, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Depends on what you're asking," he replied, his voice warm with amusement. I laughed, setting my glass down on the counter and moving closer to him. "Well, you've definitely got the whole kitchen skills thing down," I said, leaning in to inspect his work. "But I'm still trying to figure out how you managed to hide that for so long." His face turned red, and he let out a nervous chuckle, his hands pausing mid-chop. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" he muttered, though there was no real annoyance in his voice. I grinned, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "Not a chance," I said, my voice dropping slightly. "It's kind of hard to forget." He laughed, shaking his head, but I could see the way his eyes darkened as they lingered on mine. The air between us shifted, the teasing giving way to something deeper, something that made my stomach flutter. I stepped closer, my hand resting lightly on his arm, and I felt the muscles tense beneath my touch. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked, softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Al, the time," he admitted, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "It's all I can think about." His words sent a shiver through me, and I leaned in closer, our lips just inches apart. The tension between us was almost unbearable, a thick electric current that crackled in the air. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine. For a moment, we just stood there, our breaths mingling, the world outside the kitchen fading away. And then, without warning, he picked me up and set me on the kitchen table, the dishes clattering as they were pushed aside. My heart raced and I laughed, breathlessly, my hands gripping his shoulders as he stepped between my legs. Our kisses grew more urgent, more passionate, the earlier playfulness giving way to something raw and unbridled. His hands moved over my body with a desperate need, and I could feel the way his touch sent sparks shooting through me. The tension between us was overwhelming, the heat building with each passing second. My fingers tangled in high hair, pulling him closer as I kissed him with a hunger I hadn't known I was capable of. We were lost in the moment, the world outside the kitchen forgotten, until the sound of the door opening shattered the silence. We froze, our bodies still pressed together as the weight of the moment came crashing down. I turned my head toward the door, my heart leaping into my throat as I saw my husband, his father, standing there, his eyes wide with shock. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension as he took in the scene before him. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I slowly pulled away from Daniel. He stepped back, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. My husband's gaze flickered between us, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the silence stretching on forever. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "What the hell is going on?" Here the kitchen, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, the weight of my husband's fury pressing down on us like a storm about to break. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, his eyes darting between Daniel and me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "What the hell is going on here?" he repeated, his voice low and shaking with anger. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my stomach twist into knots. I stepped back from the table, my legs unsteady, clutching the edge for support. Daniel stood frozen beside me, his face pale and his hands clenched at his sides. Neither of us spoke, the enormity of what had just happened rendering us speechless. My husband stepped further into the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The anger in his eyes was mixed with a deep wounded betrayal, and it made my chest ache with guilt. "Answer me," he snapped, his voice rising. "What the hell were you two doing?" I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. What could I possibly say? How could I explain the unexplainable? My mind raced, searching for something, anything that could make this even remotely okay. But there was nothing. Nothing but the crushing weight of guilt and the knowledge that we'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like," my husband repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he looked at his son. "Do you think I'm stupid? I saw what I saw. Don't lie to me." The words stung, and I could see the pain in Daniel's eyes as he looked at his father. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. There was no way to explain this, no way to make it right. The truth was, we'd made a choice, a selfish, reckless choice, and now we had to face the consequences. My husband turned to me, his gaze piercing and accusatory. "And you?" he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "What were you thinking? How could you do this to me? To us?" I flinched at the words, a feeling, the tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Not supposed to happen like this," he echoed, his voice rising. "Again, what exactly was supposed to happen? Were you just going to keep this from me? Keep lying to my face?" The accusation cut deep, and I felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. He was right. I'd lied to him, betrayed him in the worst possible way, and no matter how much I tried to explain it to myself, how much I tried to justify it, the truth was, I'd known it was wrong from the start. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice cold and final. "You both did." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the tears streaming down my face, but I didn't try to wipe them away. Daniel stood beside me, his head bowed, his face etched with shame. My husband looked between us, his anger giving way to a deep, pained sadness that was almost harder to bear. "Get out," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Both of you. I can't even look at you right now." I nodded, my legs shaking as I stepped away from the table. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering to his father, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he followed me out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and slow. We didn't speak. As we walked down the hallway, the silence between us thick with guilt and fear. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, regret, sorrow, and a lingering, painful longing. I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it, if the moments of passion and connection were worth the pain we'd caused. I didn't know the answer, and that scared me more than anything. Daniel stopped in front of room, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and something else, something that made my heart ache. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Me too," I replied, my voice choked with emotion. He opened his mouth to say something else, but stopped, his shoulders slumping as he shook his head instead. He simply stepped into his room and closed the door behind him, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. The house felt eerily quiet, the weight of what had happened settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what would happen next, how we would move forward. From this, the future was uncertain, the consequences of our choices still unfolding. As I stood there, tears streaming down my face, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. And as much as I wanted to turn back time to undo the mistakes we'd made, I knew it was impossible. All we could do now was face the fallout and hope that somehow we'd find a way to heal. The story ended there, but the consequences of our choices lingered, unresolved and haunting. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever truly recover from the pain we'd caused.